low temperature power supply, switching power supply too. So a lot of amazing firsts that really were going to stay with computers forever. But the major parts of it were that it was a fun computer from the technical point of view. We'll get to, there are 2 points of view as to why it's sold to people. But it had to be a little fun, a computer that invited you to say, I'm not afraid of this machine, I can learn how to program it. Okay, the computer as delivered was the first time ever 2K ROMs were used in a product. The Apple II was the first product ever to use 2K ROMs, and it was the first product ever to come with a language running in turn a computer on, turn it on, and it's running BASIC. Such a thing had never been conceived of before. Before, you turn a computer on, you toggle some switches or something, you do some funny stuff, and eventually you get to load in BASIC off of a paper tape, and then you can run it. So it was really cutting to the chase of what you wanted to do yourself. You wanted to program a solution to some problem. Maybe the problem was a math puzzle. Maybe it was you wanted to enter a game out of a book. And the Apple II was just great for that. So far ahead of all the others. The trouble is, how are we going to build it? In the meantime, the Apple I was the first computer that had the keyboard. It said a computer looks like a typewriter. Processor technology introduced the Sol computer. It came with a keyboard and a little black and white display. And now it was the hot seller. It was selling 1,000 computers a month. Its stores were springing up in cities around the country. And now we had the Apple II that was 10 times better than anything else. It was going to sell at least 1,000 a month. That's a huge number for starting a business. And the trouble is, how do you build 1,000 computers when they cost $250 each to build? You need $250,000. We went to Commodore. We showed them our Apple II. We went to them, and they Jack Tramiel finally decided, no, we're going to do our own computer. They did a real cheap one. You know, it had black and white only, and it didn't have real graphics like we had, and it didn't have high resolution, and it had a crappy keyboard, and it didn't work with your home TV, and it didn't have sound and paddles and all that, and it didn't have RAM, and it didn't have expandability. So they built a cheap computer called the PET, and Radio Shack came out with a little pre-built computer also. We took our Apple II design to Al Alcorn's house of Atari. And he loved it, but Atari was about to come out with the first Pong game for home, the first home video game of all time. And they had their hands full with huge success, huge business success. They didn't have enough room and time to take on another project like our Apple computer. And we didn't have money to do it. Venture capitalists came to the garage and asked questions like, what's the market size? And I don't know business talk. I didn't go to business school. I just said, there's 1 million computers at least. He said, why do you say that? I said, because there's 1 million ham radio operators and computers are bigger than ham radio now. So it wasn't the right words for a venture capitalist, but he got Steve Jobs in touch with Mike Markkula, who lived in the Cupertino Hills. Mike had retired from Intel at the young age, I think like 32. Well, because he had a stock option, he made $1.5 million, and he had a nice home, and he had a family, and he invested money, and he followed computers. He followed electronics. And he really did believe in computers in the home someday. And he and Steve started talking about people and in the home and normal things and how we were going to make the big step to getting computers in the home was not to make them affordable. It was not to make them necessarily technically available. It was to make them palatable to people, something a person would be willing to put in a home. And they foresaw that this market was going to be gigantic. Mike Markkula predicted that in 5 years we'd be a $500 million company. All the big computer companies, IBM, Intel, Varian, Hewlett-Packard, they all said, poo-poo, it's just going to come and go, a little garage thing, it's not important. When we were at the Homebrew Computer Club, we had to just stand up and feel we were at a revolution, and we were standing up against what big business were saying. Everyone was going to have a computer in their homes, what we believed. And Mike Markkula believed this, and he had money. Well, he decided to invest $250,000 in Apple, and he became an equal partner to Steve and I. He had just as much from the start. And Mike said that I had to leave Hewlett-Packard. And for me, that was just so hard. And I went into my own mind, and I thought about what I like to do in life. I like to design computers. I like to write software. I like to show them off and do things with them. But you know what? I don't run companies. because I wasn't going to be political and do the things you have to do to run companies, and I would just be all these stories of executives getting kicked out. I would just be trampled on, and I decided not to start Apple. I went to the ultimatum meeting on the ultimatum date, and I told Steve and Mike Markle, I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to do this. And Steve went into a frenzy, and he wanted this Apple II, and he got my friends and relatives to call me and say, Steve, you've got to do this. You're going to have money coming in and all this. And finally, my friend Alan Baum called, and he said, Steve, you can start a company and be an engineer and become a manager and get rich. Or you can start this company and be an engineer and stay an engineer and get rich. And it was when he said that I had the right to stay an engineer and still make money off my design, I needed one other person saying that I knew that I had a stable base to say, as long as I'm the engineer, I deserve it. And then I went and started Apple, left Hewlett Packard that day. But it was not easy coming to that for me. Hewlett Packard around this time started another microprocessor project also before I left. They started one right in our lab, and it had a microprocessor, and it had dynamic memory, and it had 5 people working on a BASIC, and people on printer interfaces, and people on cassette tapes. I had just done all this stuff for the Apple I and the Apple II. And I went to the boss, and I said, I don't want to work on calculators. Computers are my life. I want to be on this Capricorn project here in Hewlett Packard. And they talked to me, and they turned me down. So I got turned down from what I wanted to do, work on computers in Hewlett Packard. Second turn down there. I had a third turn down too, in another division. So I tried. Well, Steve and I, when we started Apple, now we had the money and we built our first 1,000. One of the things was to build a plastic case, and there was a guy over in Palo Alto that had a foam process like they make motorcycle seats out of. The big plastic case is sort of affordable. You could make about 5 a day or 10 a day. It was we could barely get these cases made, but thank God, in the meantime, we got some money, and we put some money into making a real good quality ABS plastic case offshore, and we had to survive for about 6 months, and when we finally got that case coming, we could crank those computers out. And the Apple II was selling really well, because all the stores that were starting up around the country was brand new business. Empty shelves. Hey, Apple's the best product going. They all wanted some Apple stuff. We had a great introduction of the Apple II computer. We had great advertising. We had the best product by far and the most built one. So they just bought it, and we didn't have to fight for shelf space that somebody else already had. The stores were all new. It was just so rare. And in the company, we all felt like we were on top of a revolution as we grew towards, 10, 20, then 40 people. It's a revolution. Nobody left the company. We're the leader. We're doing these great things. It was so exciting. Every day was exciting just being around Apple IIs. Answering the phone. A lot of people remember that, heck, for those first couple of years, I answered the phone myself a lot of times and answered their technical questions. We needed a president as soon as we started the company. And we talked to Mike Scott, who ran a division at National, and he came in. He was just hard, kind of no-nonsense type guy. He could joke, and boy, but he could sure spot, what wasn't going right and make sure it got turned around and got done right. Steve Jobs is a lot like that now. You need that when you run a company. You need somebody that just will address the right things, even get rid of the right people if they have to be. We had another engineer that designed a neat switching power supply. He had engineering talents that I didn't have. I was good at computer stuff, and he was good at power supply type stuff and signals and TVs and filters and that sort of thing. So Rod Holt joined us, and he offered the other side of engineering. He liked to learn a little computers, and I learned a little from his designs. And so Mike Scott, the president, for up until the time we went public, you almost never hear of him anymore, but he had a pretty important role in history. Rod Holt, the other engineer, myself, Steve Jobs, and Mike Markle ran our marketing, which was his talent. And that was the 5 of us that ran the company for the first 2 years. Randy Wigington and Chris Espinoza were 2 high school kids that I met at the Homebrew Computer Club, and they were so interested. Heck, Mike Markle, myself, Steve Jobs, we all went to Randy Wigington's high school graduation even. And they were very instrumental in some of the early software, early projects we had going on. Mike Markle had personal ideas about the sort of software that you had to sell to people in the home. It had to be home-like things. It couldn't be mathematical computations, database storage. It had to be recipes, or it had to be run your checkbook. Well, the checkbook was a little bit of a problem. It was an important program, and Mike wrote a lot of it, and Randy helped him a bit, and I did little parts of it. But you had to read in the program on a cassette tape to the first Apple II. Once the program came in, beep, you had to read in the checkbook data. And then after it came in, beep, you'd be waiting, 10 seconds for the checkbook data. Then you could modify a check or two and write the checkbook data back out. Beep. It took forever to do anything. It was so slow. So at one of our staff meetings one day, Mike Markla was writing down the things we had to work on soon. I had been working on things like printer interfaces and serial interfaces. And our interfaces on the Apple II were really neat. You plugged a little card into the computer that attached to the cable to your device. But the card had the driver for the device. So it was truly plug and play. You plug it in, you don't have to install anything ever. But the installation came right on the card that you installed. Why don't they have printers to this day that just have the driver inside of the printer in a ROM? Or a certain kind of disk drive. Just put, if the driver were in there, you could even flash it up to date, and you would never have to keep in your computer in the operating system, with all these extension problems going bad and all. So I wish we'd go back to that kind of plug and play. Well, Mike Markla said we needed two important things. We needed a floppy disk drive for speed, and we needed a floating point basic to handle checkbook floating point numbers. And I started working on the floating point basic, but it was a real new exotic basic, and before we got too far into it, Microsoft came in the door and said they had a basic. I know they didn't write it themselves. They just bought it from some guy, but so I was like, that's okay, we were off the hook for that. Their basic was fine. We got them to adapt a few things to add commands in it to draw colors on the Apple screen. And then the floppy disk. I had this little idea before leaving Hewlett-Packard based on a new chip that came out, a little 8-bit shift register. So I had a little idea that would control the shift register to get bits coming off a tape, one bit at a time. Click, 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 click. Highs and lows coming off the floppy disk. Just like it was coming off of a tape machine. And another little machine would somehow cycle things by making decisions, and the shortest little decision maker was called a state machine. A little register that was like an address, and a little ROM that made decisions. And took all the little signals in that it needed. And I thought, oh man, I could go to Las Vegas. I said, can I go to Las Vegas if I get a floppy disk going? And Mike Markla said, yeah. And I was so naive back then, that's how I worked. So I thought, my goal is, I've got to finish the floppy disk in 2 weeks over Christmas vacation. Working Christmas Day, working New Year's Day. Got Randy Wigington to work with me all those days. I got to design a floppy disk and so we can take it to the show. And I set about and I built in this little thing that could read and write data on a floppy disk, but I never knew how floppy disks worked. I'd never seen a controller before. I'd never studied it. I didn't know how they were built. And when I was done, I had 5 chips could read and write. Our final one that we shipped came out to 8 chips. I had 5 chips working, and the competition had like 50 chips or 35. So I pulled up their manual. I pulled up a board that we had bought once and pulled out a manual, and I started going through their schematic, figuring out what all their gates did. And when I got done, I realized that mine did a lot more. And not only was mine 5 chips instead of 35, but I bypassed about another 10 chips on the Shugart disk drive that weren't needed. Why not put the data out in a more direct format? So we had a real hot product going. Randy wrote some of the software, I wrote some of the software, we got our demo going. We went to Las Vegas, walking down, seeing those lights down the street, those big flashing lights. Randy was still 17, but he made some money anyway. Because you'd have to pass the casinos, walk into the convention center. And we went to the convention center and worked all night on the last demo floppy disk we were going to make. Well, the first one. We were finally going to finish everything, and we wrote track 1. You'd have to put one disk in and read track 1, and then another disk in and write it onto that one to make a copy. Read it and write it, read it and write it. We got the final thing working at 6 in the morning, and we copied the whole disk. And then when I was done, I was looking, which one was the good one to start with? It turned out we copied like an old blank disk or something onto the new good one. So I had to go back and sleep a little, and we fixed it up. We showed it at the show, and that was the start of Apple's floppy. A neat thing happened. In all of the designs at Apple, I did everything. I designed computers. I designed cassette interfaces. I wrote the software, the mini operating system software of Apple IIs. I wrote graphics software. I wrote computer language. I designed a floppy disk. Whatever was needed, I was my own technician. I always built them myself, soldered every wire, tested them with the oscilloscope, made notations, did the code. I don't know how I did it all. It was a rare point in time that one person could just do all these little tasks, multidisciplinary is what it's called. Now Apple kind of grew up and gotten to the point that one person would design something, one person would conceive of it, a manager. Another person would design it, kind of. Another person would draft it, and another person would be the technician to build it, and then the engineer would usually come into the lab to test it, or they had testers that would test it, and then another company would make a PC board for it, and it's like, we weren't that big yet. We'd only been around for a little over a year, but we had all these little categories of jobs, but I went and I said, well, who does our PC boards for the floppy disk? And somebody said, oh, well, they're busy right now. They're doing some other board. And I said, oh, good. So I went in late at night for 2 weeks in a row and laid out this big piece of Mylar and bought some tape and learned how to tape up all the traces on the floppy disk board so I could position the chips real tightly and small the way I like things, and I could make sure that there weren't a ton of holes through the board, which is the cheap way to do things fast. And when I was getting near the end of my job, I would say the last technicians would go home about 2 in the morning. I'd say till 3 or 4 usually. I got to the end of my job and I spotted that I had 8 little holes in the board. And I figured out that, wait a minute, if I had had that shift register going the other way, I would save these. I'd only have 5 holes going through the board to get traces from the top to the bottom. So I went back to the schematic, changed the schematic, reversed everything, had gates going to different pins, went over to the layout, to the circuit board that I was laying out, the PC board, and redid it, and it only had 5 holes going through. It's kind of an art thing. No user would ever see that. But somehow I would know that it had been done the right way, that if 2 people came down with the same goal, make it as minimal as you can, I was now closer to what they'd wind up with. Any people from anywhere, an alien came, they'd come up with the same thing. There's a principle called Occam's razor. If you have 2 different approaches, take the one that's simpler is probably right. And the other rule that I use is if random people were going to invent a logical system like time on a clock or dates on a calendar, the logical system would be one that anybody from different countries and cultures and even aliens would all come up with. It's probably the most logical based on nature. Probably wouldn't be base 10 for our numbers either. So, a program came out called VisiCalc, the first spreadsheet. Showed up kind of surprisingly, and here it was, and we discovered right away people could buy an Apple II computer. VisiCalc could run on an Apple II computer only. There were 3 computers being sold to the public, 3 real personal computers: Radio Shack TRS-80, the Commodore PET, and the Apple II. Those other 2 computers had no expandability, no way to add RAM. If you bought it with 4K of RAM, you were stuck with 4K or maybe 8K. And there was no way to add a floppy disk. There was no way to add peripherals and all these new things. They were stuck. They had to go back. All somebody wants is a solution to their problems. They don't care what the hardware is. They don't care what the processor is. They don't care this. They really want something that can run some good software. And that's what really put Apple on the map. And within a year, we were going to, be going public. We had so many shareholders. When we went public, I didn't. Around that time, before we went public, well, I had a chance to get a house, which was something I always wanted in my life, by selling some stock to an investor. And I thought, well, this guy's just a fat cat with a ton of money. Why would I want to sell it to him? He's going to get rich off Apple going public. So I decided instead I would take employees of the company that were in engineering and marketing, and each one could buy 2,000 shares of my stock. So I'll get my house, but then everybody inside the company gets the benefit. And I took other people that never got any stock at all at Apple, but they were around telling jokes with us. They were doing jokes. They were helping write a little program. They weren't the big stockholders, but they kind of deserved it. I wouldn't have done whatever I did if I didn't have friends to be around doing it with. So I just gave them stock outright. And because I never started this company to have stock, to have money. So to me, it wasn't really some big deal to part with. You got to keep the most you can have and turn it into even more. Never thought that way. So this WAS plan where I sold all the stock to employees really scared our lawyers because we weren't even public yet. And they finally okayed it, but I'm sure it has never been done in other companies what I did exactly. It was really hairy. So the Apple III, now we started getting, Steve Jobs was always very paranoid that competition was right around the corner, and there were big companies like IBM and Hewlett Packard, and they were just going to stomp on us. But no, Mike Markkula said, they just have people like we do. They have little teams, groups that are designing products. And well, once VisiCalc started selling, we decided the market wasn't for people with Apple IIs. It wasn't for people playing games. It was for business. So we designed the Apple III. It was sort of conceived of by in the upper levels of the company, by the executives of the company. And what the machine that people were buying was what we were going to build, real precisely. And it would only have 2 slots in it. And it's kind of funny because the only argument Steve and I ever had over the Apple II is he said, it should only have 2 slots, one for a printer, one for a modem. And I said, no, you want lots of slots for computers. You want 8 slots. And besides, I had a clever design that got 8 slots for free. And he said, no, it's got to be 2. So I said, well, then get another computer. So that was an easy solution. But the Apple III only had 2 slots. It had a lot of other problems. But to sell the computer, you had to make it Apple II compatible. Because the Apple II was selling gung-ho everywhere around. Companies were starting up and putting out cassette tapes and floppy disks of games, and it was a big seller and a big success. So we built an Apple II modem. You flip the switch one way, and it boots up as an Apple II. Flip the switch the other way, it boots up as an Apple III. And this is a rare thing you'll ever hear in your life. We in engineering got told by marketing we had to put in extra chips to deliberately disable functionality in the Apple II mode, to make it so that it wouldn't use the extra memory and wouldn't use the 80 columns of characters mode. We had to actually put in chips to make it weaker, so that people in their head would get a better idea that the Apple III was for work and the Apple II was for games. And that was pretty misguided thinking. The Apple III had a lot of flaws. It had hardware problems. It had the only piece of software that came out with it was VisiCalc, because Apple didn't write that one. Everyone we were working on didn't come out with it. Had horrible hardware problems with traces too small and shorting and breaking and dealers complaining, and no Apple IIIs would work. So it just basically didn't take off. A year later, we fixed it and we got the clock in that was supposed to be in it. But you can't fix a problem when it gets psychologically in people's minds as a miss, that it misses the market. You can't come back and fix the problems and sell it. Maybe you could redesign it, change the shape, change the name to Apple IV, maybe it would have sold. So the Apple III never took off. Around that time, I was traveling around to a lot of computer clubs and talking to them, and telling them the stories that, like I'm telling today, and what we were up to. And I noticed that everywhere I went, there were a couple people in the audience with Apple IIIs, but everybody had Apple IIs, and how the questions for Apple IIs, and this software, and that one, do you have this, and here's this new one, why don't you try this out, and everything, the whole world was Apple II. And when I went back to the company and walked in the door, I'd be met by people like Mike Markle, and they'd say, have you heard about, well, first of all, everyone in the company had an Apple III on their desk. They didn't have Apple IIs. And then they'd start talking about, we got this project coming out on the Apple III, and we got this software thing going on the Apple III. Everybody was working for the Apple III. There were almost no Apple II projects allowed, 1980 to 1983. The world didn't know that. The world was going crazy. Apple II was the largest selling computer in the world each of those years, 80 to 83. Apple had full-page advertisements every month in national magazines. We were so successful. Go back in those 3 years, and you'll find out that not a single ad showed an Apple II. They all showed Apple IIIs. It's like there was a real world, and there was this inside the company was lost. They didn't know what the real world was doing. Thank God. Thank God Apple didn't muddle with the Apple II, changing versions, making things incompatible. It lasted for so long, and all these outside companies were putting out games and advertising this for the Apple II, and this little hardware for the Apple II, and this display board for the Apple II, and this interface board for the Apple II, and this MIDI board. So everybody in the world was advertising Apple IIs except Apple. And it was just the largest selling computer in the world for 3 years. Apple has this history of, to this day, of taking the big product that's the bread and butter of the company and not putting all the support and letting engineering have money and keeping it supported well and introducing new products as a lightweight and let them grow and give lightweight effort. Apple tends to do it the opposite. Kill the bread and butter project and try to almost forget it, almost no projects at all, and all the emphasis goes on the new. So all the work goes on the new stuff. And that happened later too with Apple II and Macintosh later on. Eventually there was a guy that joined our company in the Apple II time frame before the Apple III named Jeff Raskin. And he was a concert pianist. He had been a professor of music at colleges like Stanford. Real bright guy. And he sat down with Steve and I in the earliest days and explained that when you have something, you should look at it and make it simple so that people understand it. You should write a manual, and write a manual so that it is simpler to write the manual. The product is then better. He even said this about the Apple II, and the manual has to be very clear. But you should take a child, or somebody that has never ever seen what you're making. And you should have that person try to use it and watch them and see where they have troubles. And you should not take an expert that does know how to use it and look at them, because you'll never get valid information. Look at somebody that doesn't know how and make it so they can use it. And Jeff was a believer in this, and his thinking really influenced me a lot to believe that these are the right dreams, that computers should be designed to be just work the way people do. Humans should come first. There was a period of time with the Apple II when you bought a computer and you ran a program or you wrote a program, but you were the master of that machine. And nowadays it's like we're the slaves, because you kind of buy programs that other people wrote, and you just have to learn where their menus are and how they work and what order it is, and keep them up to date and fight them like that. And so we lost a lot of that, the idea that a lot of smart people at Apple were really trying to do, which was really to give people more power in their life themselves, rather than just buying something else of someone else's. I had a plane crash, and it was really